She elevated the detective novel into serious literature. She created a sleuth who fought deeply, loved fiercely, and refused to remain unchanged. She blended intellect, morality, theology, and crime, and reshaped the golden age of detective fiction in the process. She earned critical acclaim, academic respect, and the admiration of readers who wanted more from their mysteries. Her work challenged conventions, questioned justice, and insisted that crime fiction could be both clever and profound. But behind the sharp wit was a complicated life, secret motherhood, social scandal, financial pressure, intellectual isolation, heartbreak, illness, and a relentless demand for perfection. A woman pushing against the limits of her time, determined to be taken seriously in a world that often refused to take her seriously at all. This is the Author Files. I'm Kane, and this is the brilliant, uncompromising, and quietly radical life of Dorothy L. Sayers. Hello friends, and welcome back to another episode of the Author Files. And today we're going to be discussing the life and works of Dorothy L. Sayers. Now, you may not necessarily know her that well at all, and that's probably because Dorothy started her writing career at the same time as some other well-known authors such as Agatha Christie. But I can say that the two had great respect for each other. And I think if you go back to our Agatha Christie episode, I even mentioned that at one point Dorothy stuck up for Agatha when Agatha was accused of breaking the rules. But yes, today on the Author Files, we're stepping into the razor-sharp mind of a woman who didn't just write crime fiction, she rewired it. Dorothy L. Sayers is best known as the creator of the Lord Peter Wimsey novels, one of the most brilliant and idiosyncratic detectives in literary history. But to reduce Dorothy to a crime writer is doing her a massive disservice. She was a classicist, a poet, a playwright, a theologian, a fierce intellectual, and frankly, a woman who was rarely comfortable being boxed in. Writing during the so-called golden age of detective fiction, Dorothy used murder mysteries to explore class, morality, love, faith, and the sheer messiness of being a human. In this episode, we're digging into the life, the work, and the contradictions of Dorothy L. Sayers, from wartime London and academic ambition to why she eventually walked away from detective fiction altogether. This is the story of a woman who believed intelligence mattered, ideas mattered, and that crime novels could be far more than clever puzzles. So grab yourself a cup of tea and let's open the file. Dorothy L. Sayers was born on the 13th of June, 1893 in Oxford, at the Old Choir House on Brewer Street. Dorothy was the only child of the Reverend Henry Sayers and his wife Helen, who was known as Nell, whose maiden name was Lee. Dorothy's father came from a long clerical line. He was born in Tittleshall in Norfolk, and his own father had been a reverend originally from County Tipperary in Ireland. At the time Dorothy was born, Henry Sayers held two posts at Christ Church in Oxford. He was the headmaster of the cathedral school and also served as a chaplain at Christ Church College. Dorothy's mother Nell had very different roots. Nell was born in Shirley, in Hampshire, and came from a legal family with connections to landed gentry on the Isle of Wight. Dorothy was very proud of that Lee family connection. Later in life, she even considered using the name D. Lee Sayers professionally, before settling on Dorothy L. Sayers, and she was very firm about keeping that middle initial. When Dorothy turned 4, the family moved away from Oxford. Her father had accepted a new post as rector of Bluntisham cum Erith in the Fen County of East Anglia. This move came at a cost though. The family were cut off from Oxford's busy social and intellectual life, and that loss affected Dorothy's parents very differently. Henry Sayers was quiet, scholarly, and reserved, and he adapted to the move easily. However, Nell did not. Nell was outgoing and sociable, much like other members of the Lee family, including her great-uncle Percival Lee, who contributed to the satirical magazine Punch. Nell missed the stimulation and company of Oxford society deeply. Dorothy's childhood in the Fens was a very solitary one. She had no siblings, and there were a few children nearby of a similar age or background. Her parents were loving and attentive, but much of her early life was spent alone. During these years, Dorothy did form one lasting friendship, and that was with her cousin Ivy Shrimpton, who was just 8 years older than her. Ivy had been raised in California as a baby, then educated at an Anglican convent school in Oxford, and she spent long periods visiting the rectory at Bluntisham. The two of them bonded over books, imagination, and shared confidences, and remained close for life. Beyond that friendship, Dorothy lived largely in the world of stories. She had learned to read by the age of 4 and had immersed herself in her father's extensive library, growing up surrounded by books that would quietly shape the writer she would become. Dorothy was mostly educated at home during her early years. Her father started teaching her Latin before she even turned 7. She also had a governess who taught her other subjects like French and German. In the January of 1909, when Dorothy was 15, her parents sent her off to boarding school, the Godolphin School in Salisbury. According to her biographer, Barbara Reynolds, Dorothy really threw herself into school life. She acted in plays, some of which she even wrote and produced herself, sang solos, played violin and viola in the orchestra, and formed some intense friendships. But despite all that activity, Dorothy wasn't entirely happy there. Starting at 15, when most girls joined much younger, around 8 years old made her something of an outsider. Some of the other students didn't quite accept her, and a few teachers weren't thrilled by her independent streak. On top of that, Dorothy was a committed Anglican with strong high church beliefs, and she found the school's brand of Christianity deeply off-putting. Her biographer, James Brabazon, described it as a low church pietism, dull and lacking passion, so much so that it nearly turned her away from religion altogether. Things got even tougher for Dorothy in 1911, when an outbreak of measles occurred at Godolphin. Dorothy was so ill she almost died. Dorothy had lost her hair temporarily and started wearing wigs because of this. Her mother was allowed to stay at the school to nurse her back to health, and thankfully, Dorothy recovered in time to sit for the Gilchrist Scholarship exam. After taking the exam, Dorothy won the scholarship in March 1912. It was a big deal. It was worth £50 a year for 3 years, and its whole point was to help women get into university. The scholarship opened the door for Dorothy to study modern languages at the Somerville College in Oxford. Because of her negative experience with the religious atmosphere of Godolphin, Dorothy deliberately chose Somerville instead of an Anglican one. Somerville College, being an all-women's college, turned out to be a perfect fit for Dorothy. According to biographer Catherine Kenny, Somerville encouraged its students to take leading roles in arts and public life, which really suited Dorothy's drives and talents. Dorothy enjoyed her time there and later said that she developed a scholarly way of thinking that stayed with her for life. Dorothy was said to have been a top student, and you can see how her broad, liberal education at Oxford influenced the novels and essays she wrote later on. While at Somerville, Dorothy made some lifelong friends, most notably Mariel St. Clair Byrne. Mariel went on to play an important role in Dorothy's career and eventually became her literary executor, managing her work after her death. Dorothy also co-founded a literary society called the Mutual Admiration Society, along with Amphilus Middlemore and Charis Ursula Barnett. The name? Well, that was Dorothy's idea. She joked that if they didn't call themselves that, the rest of the college certainly would. This group was a place where female students could read and critique each other's work. Interestingly, this society was a sort of a precursor to the famous Inklings, the all-male Oxford literary group that included writers like C.S. Lewis. Dorothy never joined the Inklings, since it was men only, but she was friendly with C.S. Lewis and others in the group. Another interesting skill of Dorothy's was that she had a beautiful contralto voice, so she joined the Oxford Back Choir. During this time, she developed a bit of an unrequited crush on the choir's director, Hugh Allen. Later in her university years, Dorothy was drawn to a fellow student called Roy Ridley, who later became chaplain of Balliol College. His looks and manner actually inspired her most famous creation, Lord Peter Wimsey. Dorothy worked hard, encouraged by her tutor Mildred Pope, and in 1915 she earned first-class honours in what was called modern French. Not what she only called it, but was really medieval French in her finals. However, despite those excellent results, Dorothy wasn't awarded a degree right away. At the time, Oxford didn't officially give degrees to women. It wasn't until 1920 that the university changed its rules, and Dorothy was among the first women to finally receive her degree. After graduating from Oxford, Dorothy, who'd actually started writing poetry as a child, published 2 small volumes of verse, Op. 1 in 1916 and Catholic Tales and Christian Songs in 1918. To support herself, Dorothy taught modern languages at Hull High School for girls, but teaching didn't really suit her, and in 1917 Dorothy landed a job with the publisher and bookseller Basil Blackwell back in Oxford, which was a much better fit. A younger contemporary of hers, Doreen Wallace, later described Dorothy during this period as somebody brimming with energy and an incredibly well-stocked mind. Even at just 24, she knew an enormous amount about all kinds of subjects, not just her speciality, Old French literature, and she demanded facts, nothing less. But she also had a lighter side, often seen loping around Oxford looking for fun, long and slim, with a small head held alert on a slender neck. Dorothy stayed working at Blackwell's for 2 more years before moving to France. And in 1919, Dorothy took a job in Normandy, working as an assistant to Eric Welpton, an English teacher. Dorothy had been in love with Welpton back at Oxford. But by 1921, Dorothy was back in London, teaching at an all-girls school in Acton. She also began an intense relationship with fellow writer John Cornos. The affair lasted until October 1922, when Cornos left the country. Then, and in the same year, Dorothy switched careers, becoming a copywriter at S.H. Benson, which was Britain's largest advertising agency at the time. Although Dorothy had had some reservations about the misleading nature of advertising, she became really skilled at it and stayed working there until 1929. Dorothy created successful advertising campaigns for products like Guinness Stout and Coleman's Mustard. People sometimes credit her with coming up with the famous slogan, "My goodness, my Guinness," but actually that appeared in 1935, several years after she left Benson's. What Dorothy did do, though, was introduce the Guinness toucan, with artwork by John Gilroy, and she wrote catchy verses to go with it. For example, "If he can say as you can, Guinness is good for you, how grant to be a toucan, just think what two can do." The toucan became iconic and featured in Guinness ads for decades. According to her biographer, Dorothy enjoyed the fun and camaraderie at Benson's, much like the lively atmosphere she experienced at Oxford. While working in advertising, Dorothy dedicated her free time to writing fiction. Detective novels were popular, and she saw a chance to write books that were both accessible and well-crafted. Dorothy studied the best writers closely to master the craft. A later crime novelist, J.I.M. Stewart, said that while many detective writers of the time were either dull or overreached with their stories, Dorothy found a way to give her tales a pleasant literary flair, all while staying true to her own imagination. Dorothy's first detective novel, Whose Body, introduced Lord Peter Wimsey. She actually started writing it before joining Benson's, and it came out in 1923. Reviews were mixed. Some critics found it clever but complicated, although Wimsey was an unconvincing detective. Others praised the novel, saying the ending wasn't an anticlimax that they'd hoped to hear more from Wimsey. Dorothy's relationship with John Cornos, which lasted until 1922, was never consummated. That was because Cornos didn't want children, and Dorothy, for religious reasons, refused to use contraception. After that ended, Dorothy met a man named Bill White, and in 1924 she had a son called John Anthony White. White, described by the novelist A.N. Wilson as a motorcycling rough trade, turned out to be married, so the relationship didn't last. Dorothy's son was then raised by Ivy Shrimpton, her cousin and lifelong friend who already had foster children. Dorothy kept John's parentage a secret from him and everybody else. At first, he only knew her as Cousin Dorothy, and later she pretended to be his adopted mother. He only learned the truth after his mother's death. Whose Body was published in both Britain and the United States, and it sold well enough that Dorothy's London publisher, Fisher Unwin, asked Dorothy for a sequel. Before that sequel appeared, Dorothy brought Lord Peter Wimsey back in a short story called The Fascinating Problem of Uncle Meleager's Will, which was published in Pearson's magazine in July 1925. The story, along with other Wimsey short fiction, was later collected and published in 1928 as Lord Peter Views the Body. The second full Wimsey novel, Clouds of Witness, was published in 1926, and this time the reception was strongly positive. Critics praised it as amusing, lively, witty, and consistently engaging, noting the freshness of the characters and the absence of tired detective story cliches. Other reviewers went on to highlight the clever construction, the sheer number of clues, and a conclusion that genuinely surprised them. It appeared Dorothy had hit her stride. So much so that by this point, Dorothy was being compared to Agatha Christie, not just as a writer of puzzles, but as someone who could write detective stories that also worked as rich, entertaining novels about real people. The same year would also bring wedding bells for Dorothy, as she married Captain Oswald Arthur Fleming, known as Mac, a well-known journalist who had been previously divorced. Dorothy's son took Fleming's surname, but did not live with the couple. The marriage began happily, but became more difficult as Fleming's health declined. Even so, they would remain together until his death from a stroke in 1950, when he was 68. Dorothy continued to write Wimsey novels at a steady pace. Unnatural Death followed in 1927, and The Unpleasantness at the Bologna Club came in 1928. 1928 was particularly busy for Dorothy, as she also published Lord Peter Views the Body, and had edited and introduced a major anthology of crime writing, titled Great Short Stories of Detection, Mystery and Horror, which was later released in the United States under the title The Omnibus of Crime. 1929 saw her final year working at the advertising agency, and Dorothy and her husband left London and moved to the small Essex town of Witham. It would remain their home for the rest of their lives. Also in 1929, Dorothy published Tristan in Brittany, a verse and prose translation of 12th century poetic fragments from the Romance of Tristan by Thomas of Britain. The book included an introduction by the scholar George Saintsbury, and Dorothy was widely praised for making a historically important medieval poem available in modern English for the very first time. In 1930, Dorothy became a founder member of the famous Detection Club. It grew out of informal dinner parties organised by the writer Anthony Berkeley, originally just as an excuse for detective writers to enjoy each other's company and talk shop. The dinners were such a success that the group decided to formalise things, creating a club with G.K. Chesterton as its president, someone Dorothy greatly admired. Dorothy was one of the club's most enthusiastic members and was largely responsible for shaping its character. Dorothy devised the famously elaborate initiation ritual, where new members swore to write detective fiction without relying on divine revelation, feminine intuition, coincidence, acts of God, or what she memorably called mumbo jumbo or jiggery pokery. They also pledged moderation in use of gangs, conspiracies, death rays, ghosts, hypnotism, trapdoors, supercriminals, and mysterious poisons unknown to science. The club charged no membership fees, so to raise money, its members collaborated on creative projects. The first of these, organised by Dorothy, was Behind the Screen in 1930, a crime story broadcast on BBC Radio with 6 club members each taking turns to write and read a 15-minute episode. Also in 1930, Dorothy published 2 novels. One of them, The Documents in the Case, came about after a suggestion from fellow writer Robert Eustace, who was also a medical doctor. Eustace supplied the scientific elements and the central plot device, while Dorothy shaped the material into prose. She hoped to write something in the tradition of Wilkie Collins, whom she admired deeply and was also researching at the time for a biography. The novel was largely written in first person, told through letters exchanged between characters, another deliberate echo of 19th century fiction. Lord Peter Wimsey does not appear in the book, and one biographer later remarked that Dorothy seemed to enjoy the freedom of writing without him. Reviews were generally favourable, but somewhat restrained, and Dorothy herself was disappointed, feeling she hadn't done full justice to the material. The other novel Dorothy published in 1929 was Strong Poison. The book introduced Harriet Vane, a writer accused of murder whom Wimsey sets out to prove innocent. Dorothy originally planned for Wimsey to marry Harriet at the end of the novel and retire from detection altogether, bringing the series to a close. But financial reality intervened, and instead she went on to write 5 more Wimsey novels before the 2 characters were eventually allowed to become engaged. The character of Harriet Vane is widely seen as Dorothy's alter ego. She shares many of the author's qualities, both strengths and flaws, and is described in the novels as striking and interesting, rather than conventionally beautiful. That description echoed comments made about Dorothy herself. One contemporary writer noted that while she wasn't traditionally beautiful, Dorothy was extraordinarily magnetic to listen to. In 1931, Dorothy collaborated again with members of the Detection Club, this time on a longer BBC serial called The Scoop, and on a collaborative novel titled The Floating Admiral. Dorothy also edited another volume of great short stories of detection, mystery, and horror, and on her own wrote The 5 Red Herrings, which was published in the United States under the title Suspicious Characters. Harriet Vane doesn't appear in that book, but she returns as the central figure in the next Wimsey novel, Have His Car Case, which was published in 1932. Wimsey solves the murder once again, but his romantic hopes fare no better than before. The book was very well received. Reviewers praised its ingenuity and its final twist, which was described as startling but fair, rewarding only the most attentive readers. One paper went so far as to call Dorothy the greatest of all detective story writers, though it worried that her plots might sometimes be too clever for comfort. Over the next 2 years, Dorothy published 2 more Wimsey novels, Murder Must Advertise in 1933 and The 9 Tailors in 1934, neither of which featured Harriet Vane. Dorothy also released a collection of short stories titled Hangman's Holiday, which showcased not only Lord Peter Wimsey, but also another recurring character, Montague, a travelling salesman who sells mysteries in his spare time. Alongside her fiction, Dorothy edited a third and final volume of great short stories of detection, mystery, and horror, and began reviewing crime novels for the Sunday Times. Her reviews covered most of her major contemporaries, including fellow queens of crime like Agatha Christie and Marjorie Allingham. Through these reviews, she made her views on literature very clear. She expected excellent prose, originality, and a refusal to recycle tired plots and devices. Murder Must Advertise proved to be popular, but despite this, Dorothy was unhappy. She described the novel as an artistic failure, saying she tried and not entirely succeeded to contract two artificial worlds, advertising and the post-war culture of the so-called bright young people. Dorothy's biographers, however, were kinder, describing the book as flawed but brilliant, while still ranking it below her later Wimsey novels. When 1935 came along, Dorothy published what she intended to be the final Lord Peter Wimsey novel, called Gaudy Night. The intentional final story was set at Harriet Vane's old Oxford College and centres on a series of malicious acts, including attempted murder. Wimsey uncovers the culprit in time to prevent further harm, and at the very end of the book, he proposes to Harriet in Latin. And then Harriet accepts, also in Latin. Also in that year, Dorothy delivered a lecture in Oxford in May and then in London in June, titled Aristotle on Detective Fiction. In it, she humorously argued that, judging by poetics, Aristotle's greatest unfulfilled wish was actually for a good detective story. Dorothy also worked on a film script called The Silent Passenger. Although she was promised editorial control, it never materialized, and the finished version bore little resemblance to what she'd intended. According to her biographer David Coombs, the character of Wimsey ended up looking like a member of the mafia. By this point in Dorothy's life, she was growing weary of the solitary life of a novelist, and welcomed the chance to collaborate again with her Oxford friend Muriel St. Clair Byrne. Together, they wrote a new Wimsey story for the stage. Busman's Honeymoon, described as a detective comedy in 3 acts, toured briefly in the provinces before opening in London's West End. During rehearsals for Busman's Honeymoon, Dorothy, who'd remained closely involved in her son John's life, wrote to him about the exhausting and unfamiliar world of theatre production. The London premiere took place at the Comedy Theatre in December 1936, with Dennis Arundel and Veronica Turley playing Wimsey and Harriet. The play ran for over a year, and while it was still on stage, Dorothy rewrote it as a novel. The novel was published in 1937, and it became the final full-length book to feature Lord Peter Wimsey. Dorothy was also invited to write a drama for the Canterbury Festival, which was due to be performed inside Canterbury Cathedral. Dorothy's contribution was The Zeal of Thy House, a blank verse drama about the life and work of William of Sens, one of the architects of Canterbury Cathedral. It opened in June 1937, received strong reviews, and even turned a profit for the festival. The following year, Dorothy returned to religious drama with He That Should Come, a nativity play written for radio and broadcast by the BBC on Christmas Day. In 1939, the Canterbury Festival staged another of her plays, The Devil to Pay. Also in 1939, Dorothy published a collection of short stories titled In the Teeth of the Evidence, featuring Wimsey, Montague, and other of her familiar characters. Dorothy also began a series of articles for The Spectator called the Wimsey Papers, which ran from November 1939 to January 1940. In these pieces, she used Wimsey, his family, and his friends as a way of expressing her own thoughts on life and politics during the opening months of the Second World War. For the theatre, Dorothy wrote a comedy called Love All, a wry take on the eternal triangle. It opened at London Fringe Theatre in April 1940. Reviews were friendly. The Times said that Dorothy poked some agreeable fun at a number of conventions, sentimental, literary and theatrical, while the stage described the play as very amusing and provocative. But by this point, Britain was at war, and there was little appetite in the West End for another light comedy, so the play never transferred. The work that truly came to dominate Dorothy's life from the 1940s onwards was her translation of Dante's Divine Comedy. Dorothy later said she began the project after reading the original Italian in an air raid shelter during bombing raids. To her, Dante felt urgently contemporary. As she put it, I saw the whole layout of hell as something actual and contemporary, something that one can see by looking into oneself or into the pages of tomorrow's newspaper. I saw it, that is, as a judgment of fact, unaffected by its period, unaffected by its literary or dogmatic origins, and I recognized at the same moment that the judgment was true. Dorothy believed that Dante was simply the most incomparable storyteller who ever set pen to paper, and felt that the moral crisis of her own society, declining faith, dishonesty, exploitation, and disharmony, mirrored those Dante had confronted in his own time. Once Dorothy began reading seriously, she became completely consumed by the work. Dorothy later described the experience like this: I bolted my meals, neglected my sleep, work and correspondence, drove my friends crazy, and paid only a distracted attention to the doodle bugs which happened to be infesting the neighborhood at the time, until I had panted my way through the three realms of the dead from top to bottom and from bottom to top. Alongside her work on Dante, Dorothy continued to write drama. At the BBC's request, she created a cycle of 12 radio plays portraying the life of Jesus. The Man Born to be King broadcasted between 1941 and 1942. These plays reached a huge audience during what one biographer described as the darkest days of the Second World War. From the outset, Dorothy insisted on realism, modern speech, and a fully human portrayal of Jesus. Although Jesus had appeared in passion plays for centuries, this was the first time an actor had played him on the radio. Not everybody approved, though. Some conservative Christian groups reacted with outrage. The Lord's Day Observance Society condemned the series as a revolting imitation of the voice of our divine Saviour and Redeemer, declaring that to impersonate the divine Son of God in this way is an act of irreverence bordering on the blasphemous. The actor Robert Spielite, who played Jesus, later said that the play succeeded because we did not approach the parts in a reverential frame of mind. We approached them exactly as if it was any other kind of play. As the broadcast continued, the controversy gradually faded. The BBC's Religious Advisory Committee, representing all of the major Christian denominations, backed this series, and it eventually came to be seen as one of Dorothy's greatest ever achievements. Another major work from the wartime years was Dorothy's extended essay, The Mind of the Maker. In it, she argued that human creativity is the quality that gives making its best chance of understanding, however imperfectly, the nature of God's mind. Between 1944 and 1949, Dorothy published 2 volumes of essays, a collection of children's stories, and wrote another religious play, The Just Vengeance, which was commissioned for the 750th anniversary of Lichfield Cathedral. Dorothy later admitted the play was very stale and abstract, adding that it pleaded theologians far more than it pleased the actors. In 1949, Penguin Books published The Divine Comedy, Canticle 1, Hell, in Dorothy's translation. Reviews were overwhelmingly positive. One critic wrote, "Her translation is not only scholarly, but is being held as the best English translation of that poem." In The Observer, Sir Ronald Storrs praised the illuminating translation and Dorothy's compendious notes, saying future readers would be profoundly in her debt. The Chicago Tribune, however, criticised some of the archaisms in her language, but concluded, "But all in all, it looks to me like the translation to read. You can't read very far into it and still think Dante is dull." By 1950, Dorothy was formally recognised for her work when she was awarded an honorary doctorate of letters by the University of Durham, but that same year brought a personal blow. After years of declining health, her husband Mac died at their home in Witham in June. In 1951, as part of the Festival of Britain, Dorothy wrote what would become her final play, The Emperor Constantine. The stage described it as long, rambling, episodic, and wholly absorbing. In 1953, Dorothy made one last return to crime fiction with No Flowers by Request, a collaborative serial published in the Daily Sketch. She co-wrote it alongside E.C.R. Lorac, Anthony Gilbert, Gladys Mitchell, and Christiana Brandt. The following year saw the publication of introductory papers on Dante, and in 1955 Penguin's Books released Purgatory, the second volume of her translation of the Divine Comedy. Like Hell before it, the book sold extremely well. Dorothy's final published works appeared in 1957, The Song of Roland, translated from French, and a second volume of essays on Dante. On the 17th of December 1957, Dorothy L. Sayers died suddenly at her home in Witham from a coronary thrombosis. She was just 64 years old. 6 days later, she was cremated at Golders Green Crematorium. Her ashes were later buried at the base of the tower of St. Anne's Church in Soho. Her translation of the third and final part of the Divine Comedy, 2/3 complete at the time of her death, was finished by Barbara Reynolds. So, when you step back and look at Dorothy L. Sayers as a whole, what's striking isn't just how much she did, it's how deliberately she refused to be boxed in. She refused to be boxed in. She began as a poet, became famous as a detective novelist, reshaped the crime genre from the inside, then walked away from it at the height of her popularity to translate Dante and write religious drama that challenged audiences just as much as it inspired them. She never saw detective fiction as light or disposable. To Dorothy, it was a serious literary form that deserved structure, fairness, intelligence, and respect for the reader. Lord Peter Wimsey wasn't just a puzzle-solving machine, he was a vehicle for exploring grief, morality, justice, love, and responsibility. And through Harriet Vane, Dorothy allowed herself to question the role of women, the cost of independence, and whether love should ever require self-erasure. Yet, for all her brilliance, Dorothy was never comfortable being admired simply as a crime writer. She wanted to be taken seriously as a thinker, as a theologian, a classicist, a translator, and a moral voice in a world she often felt was losing its intellectual and spiritual bearings. Her work on Dante wasn't an escape from the modern world, but a way of confronting it head on, using medieval poetry to make sense of war, cruelty, and human failure. Dorothy could be sharp, difficult, funny, impatient with nonsense, and fiercely demanding of herself and of others. But she was also deeply loyal, capable of enormous affection, and quietly generous, especially to younger writers and collaborators. Even her flaws feel inseparable from her achievements. Dorothy L. Sayers didn't just leave behind a shelf of books, she left behind a challenge to read more carefully, think more rigorously, write more honestly and never assume that popularity and depth have to be opposites. Whether through a murder mystery, a radio play, or a translation of Dante's journey through hell, purgatory, and paradise, she trusted her audience to rise to the occasion. And that trust in readers, listeners, and in human intelligence itself may be her most enduring legacy of all. Okay, so that was the life and story of the amazing Dorothy L. Sayers. And to me, she had such the career working in advertising, becoming a master of crime, like fiction, then turning her talents to more academical projects, such as the retellings and translations of Dante's. She certainly lived a very interesting life, and I'm really happy that we got to discuss her life on the podcast. So next week, please join me as we will be delving into the life of Kafka, and I think it might be a very big episode. I'm not sure. I'll know at time of recording. I know the research I've done is quite thorough, so I'm really excited to share that one with you guys. Anyway, if you've liked this episode, please subscribe, leave a comment, come and follow us on our socials. On Instagram, you can find us at The Author Files. On TikTok, we're The Author Files Podcast. You can also follow any updates on our website, which is www.theauthorfiles.co.uk. And if you missed last week's episode, it was on Charles Dickens, so please go back and listen to that one. It's a real treat. Anyway, enough of me babbling on. So I will catch you guys next Friday at the usual time. Episodes release at 10 a.m. GMT time on all your platforms. And yeah, that's all from me for this week. So enjoy the rest of your January. We'll soon be in February, which is exciting. This feels like the quickest January we've ever had, to be honest. Well, to me it does anyway. Yeah, and also, just before I go, if you'd like to start reading any of Dorothy's works, I would seriously recommend starting with Strong Poison. It's a very good mystery, and it will keep you enthralled. Okay, I'll catch you guys next week. Stay safe, stay reading. See ya!